The basement of Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore is not a place where you would want to spend a lot of time. It's dark, it's cramped down there, it's dirty, it's filled with old equipment. It has that funny odor that basements seem to collect, that odor of damp and mold and spider webs. Young Thorogood, as he was known then, spent a lot of time in that basement. There were many reasons why. The teenager had a habit of pulling pranks on teachers and causing trouble, of speaking too loudly and getting distracted when he was in class. And so getting sent to the basement was what passed for detention back in the 1920s at Frederick Douglass High School. It was what happened when the exasperated teachers simply didn't know what to do with him anymore. His latest prank had gone a little too far, and Thorogood was banished to the basement for the better part of the day, while as penance, the principal required him to read the entire U.S. Constitution and learn it backwards and forwards. There was going to be a quiz afterward. The principal told the boy that if he hadn't read the document like he was supposed to, he was going to find himself back in the basement in the afternoon. His father, who was a hard-working railroad porter, and his mother, who was a teacher, would be even more angry than the principal if they found out about this. So he was determined to take the punishment with grace. Which is how a teenager named Thorogood found himself sitting on the damp basement steps, reading the Constitution over and over again by candlelight. A few years later, the young man, who now went by Thurgood, was in college, where he was, yes, suspended multiple times for playing pranks on fellow students and teachers. But even so, his quick mind and capacity for hard work brought him to law school, and then when he was in his early 30s, to the highest court in the land, where he made a name for himself by litigating civil rights cases. In 1954, that young man would argue and win one of the most important cases in the history of the United States, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which ended all racial segregation in American schools. And then finally, in 1967, that boy, Thurgood Marshall, who had been forced to read the Constitution by candlelight while serving detention in the basement of his high school, would become the first African-American justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. By the way, just as an interesting aside to that remarkable story, I should mention that Thurgood Marshall was also a lifelong Episcopalian, and he served as a member of the vestry and as senior warden, how about that, of his beloved St. Philip's Church in Harlem. And the 2009 General Convention added him to our calendar of saints. It's kind of funny to think about going to a vestry meeting with a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice, but that's neither here nor there. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that expression, turning lemons into lemonade. There are often times in our lives that appear to be hard, to be difficult, even some that appear to be unbearable. And then sometimes in retrospect, it's those exact times that are formative for us in ways that we never could have anticipated. Do you think that a 15-year-old Thurgood Marshall thought while he was serving detention that his study of the U.S. Constitution would lead him to law school and eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court? I highly doubt it. But in retrospect, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? What we internalize when we're 15, 16, 17 years old can change the entire course of our lives in some pretty dramatic ways. I wonder if Thurgood had been a better student, ironically, he might have led a less important life in some ways. Or if the principal had assigned him Shakespeare instead of the Constitution, would he have turned out to be a writer or an actor, maybe? Nobody can say. What we do know with certainty is that one thing led to another, and that boy from Baltimore would go on to change the fabric of American society for the better. In our Easter season, We are given a series of readings from the Acts of the Apostles that deal with the earliest history of the church. And we're also given this series of gospel accounts that recall the first disciples' bewilderment and surprise at meeting a risen and resurrected Jesus. I know that it's hard mentally to go back to the beginning, so to speak, and consider the state of Jesus' followers in the wake of his execution, but let's just try for a moment. It's hard because we have 2 millennia now of history, institutional, political, theological history, that kind of weighs down on us. We're not used to hearing about the church as a tiny group of bewildered Jews from a Roman backwater. We're much used to hearing about Christendom. That is, the church's eventual, almost complete fusion with Western European life. But let's rewind the clock. Let's go back there to the beginning. That is, after all, what these readings are inviting us to do, to go back and remember how it was for them. We're told in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles that at the time of Jesus' resurrection and ascension, there were 120 disciples in the entire city of Jerusalem. That's it. 120. That's what Acts tells us. Just to give you a sense of scale, there were over 100 people here on Easter Sunday. Right in this church. So what we're saying is that one relatively small church's worth of people in the entire city of Jerusalem who considered themselves to be disciples of Jesus right after his death. Even if we believe that there was a bigger contingent of them up in Nazareth or Galilee around Capernaum, people who knew and interacted with Jesus during his lifetime, during his 2 years of public ministry, we're talking about at most maybe 500 people in the entirety of the world who would have called themselves Christian. And I think that's probably on the generous side. I should add a small footnote that term Christian did not exist at this period. And in the book of Acts, it calls these people followers of the way. That's what they call themselves. My point is that there are a few hundred people scattered around in a few small communities, probably just waiting for the other shoe to drop, and to end this entire story. You get the sense that even these diehards are almost ready to throw in the towel. We've had a good run. Maybe it's time for us to go home. And then something remarkable happens. An empty tomb. A resurrected Jesus. And not just one appearance, but many appearances. They start seeing Jesus everywhere. He eats with them here in Jerusalem. He eats with them on the shores of Galilee. He eats with them on the road to Emmaus. Are you noticing a pattern here? He eats with them a lot. Strangest of all, it takes him a while to recognize him most of the time, almost as if they were experiencing him alive in some new way. And yet other times, in the same way that they had before. The experiences are muddled and messy. They have the concreteness of reality and lived experience. Oddly, they remember little details like what he ate. Apparently, Jesus liked fish. But I'm getting off topic. What I'm really driving at here is that by any rights, folk, by any normal rights, by any outside observer's standards, the Christian movement should have been a failure. It should have ended with the death of their leader, as most other contemporary movements did, even in first century Judea. There were many other leaders whose movements were snuffed out when they were executed by the Romans. But somehow, in the most improbable and unbelievable way, because of the risen Christ, because of those experiences, his followers discovered that the worst case scenario had actually become a new lease on life. They discovered that he had told them the truth from the beginning, that he really was going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and that he wasn't talking about a temple on a hill in Jerusalem, he was talking about himself. Somehow, the worst outcome, death, was barely a speed bump. It's actually quite remarkable in the annals of human history. For me, the early history of Christianity is a story about transforming the bad, in this case, the worst of all possible outcomes, into the good. The story of the Christian movement appears to end at the worst possible way. Its leader is executed, its followers are scattered, its community is in disarray, its key figures are even denying that they knew Jesus when they asked them. And yet somehow, against all odds, this Jewish reform movement emerged as the dominant religious belief of the Western world. It's a wild and improbable story, and it didn't have to be that way. Nothing about the success of Christianity, at least from a historical perspective, was ever guaranteed. But you know what? In another way, I think it makes perfect sense. Because after all, the gospel that he had taught was about the transformation of all things. The gospel he had taught said things like, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." He said, "Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies, it yields much fruit." That's what he taught them. And here in Luke, it says that he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and they began to understand at last that death had become their victory. The end was actually a new kind of beginning. Jesus' death wasn't the end of a movement, it was the start of something new. Everything, absolutely everything they thought they knew had been turned upside down in the presence of a risen Christ. All of which is to say that there is nothing that you have done, that I have done, that we haven't done, nothing that we have failed to do, nothing that we've experienced or said, nothing that we have participated in, no matter what it is, that cannot be transformed and used for the good. Bad things will happen to us in our lives. Sometimes we even bring those bad things on ourselves. But I also believe that all things can be used for the good for those who love God. If a child serving in detention can be called to serve his faith and his country by advancing justice, your hard times can be transformed. If the cross, a symbol of oppression and death, can also become a symbol of life and hope, how much more can we be transformed? If a tiny group of reformers and heretics can challenge emperors and kings, then what's keeping us from challenging our culture, the problems of our day? Sometimes, folks, things begin in a basement, or maybe they begin in a tomb. But they don't have to end there. They end only when they have fulfilled God's purpose. If we take our trials, our troubles, our hardships, and we offer the same to the glory of God, they too can be transformed. Or as Jesus himself said, "Behold, I make all things new." Lord God, you turned death and shame into new life and new hope. We ask you today to bring your transformation into our lives, into our hearts, and our minds, that the bad may be turned to good, that wrong may be made right, that sorrow may be turned to joy, to the honor and glory of your holy name. Amen.